All right. Well, good morning, everyone. It's 10 a.m. on the dot. I hope everyone is having a very pleasant good morning wherever you may be. I know we've had some erratic weather in the last week or so, from cold to hot. So hope everyone's doing well. I'm Julie Arthur. I'm the chair for the CASH organization, and I'm also the executive director of facilities and planning for Palm Springs Unified School District. And we all hope you and your families are doing well during our COVID-19 pandemic. CASH, as you know, has been providing you with weekly webinars to ensure that we serve our members with the latest and best information to help school districts and county offices of education and all of our vendors as we look to the return of students and teachers to our schools coming up this fall. I want to remind everyone on the webinar today that tomorrow, Friday, June 12th, is the deadline to submit self-nominations for a legislative advisory committee. This next 2 years is going to be big on the legislative front. You know, things are going to be coming crazy, funding, everything going on. So we really need people in there that can really help us make sure that we're speaking for our school districts that the legislature hears. So I also know so many of our school districts and county office of education folks are overwhelmed right now, but we do have 3 public sector openings. We have 3 private, and I really am hoping that we can get some public sector people in here. I know it's tough. I'm asking you to reach deep and send in a self-nomination, and I'm especially reaching out to our Northern California folks. We really need to have your representation, your voice at the table, because your issues may be different than what we're having down here in Southern California. So I know it's difficult with everything going on, but we need you. All right, so last week, CASH's webinar was communications, and we talked about parents, students, employees, and community. Our friends at FM3 gave some very upbeat information obtained from surveys on how parents stayed informed and what information they're looking for. And we also discussed our students with special needs and their unique challenges. We had moms and employees' perspectives, and then we talked about our CEQA challenges. So for a recording of this, with the answers prepared from last week, please visit our CASH website and click on the COVID-19 link. You can see this info and many other information on what we've been able to gather on the COVID-19. So today is the 11th in our series of webinars, and it's titled The Risk and Liabilities Anticipated in Opening Schools. So we missed Jeff last week, but this week we do have Jeff Becker with us, our CASH's vice chair with the County Office of Schools and Superintendents in Fresno. Jeff, how are you doing?
Well, I'm doing all right, Julie. Thank you. And it's very nice to be back on the call with everybody. I think all of us are experiencing how busy things are right now with last-minute preparations, particularly at county offices as we're opening up our administrative offices again very soon. So in Fresno, we're not meeting the governor's mark on a couple of the criteria and stats that they monitor, but we're meeting most of them. So we're watching that very carefully with our health department as we prepare to come back, you know, and really being ready to pivot if the county health department pulls back. So I've got a call later today with our county health department and superintendents. We've also just been very busy with the Department of Public Health guidance that came out last Friday and the CDE guidance that came out on Monday. And that's been one of the main focuses in our office in our cabinet meetings, of reviewing the draft plans that we had started and making sure they're congruent with that guidance that came out and making those adjustments to what we were thinking.
Yeah, Jeff, we're in meetings this morning as well on our hybrid learning that we're doing here. Riverside County is moving full bore ahead with opening up. In fact, I will probably be going to the gym tomorrow So first time in a couple months, it's opening up. And unfortunately, I hate to let everyone know, but probably no Coachella Fest this year. It's going to be 2021 before that happens, but we are moving ahead. We'll see what happens. We're all, at least in our district, we're being prepared that if we shut down again, just how we can react with whatever this next phase brings about, if we need to again retract and shut down a little bit, or go forward and just keep moving. So it is a amazing thing that keeps moving around. And I think the logistics of everything going on, trying to procure the things we need from the recommendations that came out.
Yeah, the logistics are really in full swing right now to obtain the necessary PPE and face coverings and hand sanitizer, and county offices are very busy with that right now, hoping to help our district shortly, because the Office of Emergency Services is providing PPE for school districts that will come through county offices. So I'm going to the warehouse tomorrow to figure out where to put 3 truckloads of PPE, which is a great problem for us to have, because it's going to be good for our schools. So, but we've got some work to do in that area. So we're going to work on that as well.
Yeah, that's the same thing is being prepared for where we're going to store and how we're going to get it out to our schools. And I think we're looking at something like 4 masks a day, and I mean things like it's going to be unique and challenge, but again, we're up for it, right?
Absolutely are. It is certainly a very busy time, and I know myself and a lot of our colleagues in the facilities field kind of thrive on those moments of getting things done. So it's time to dig deep in that regard, to meet that challenge before us. Well, let me cover a few housekeeping items, and then I will introduce our panelists that we have, and we'll kick off today's webinar. So first of all, we do want to hear everyone's questions. So if you are joining us for the first time, in the chat box on your screen, you can type your questions throughout the presentations, and Cash monitors that chat box. We do ask that you make sure that you are chatting with all panelists and attendees to make sure that everyone sees the question, and you can do that by hitting the caret in the to box in the chat box. And again, we monitor that so we can pick up those questions as we go. And finally, we are recording the webinar, as Julie mentioned, and will be made available to Cash members for future viewing on our website. So let me now introduce our panelists. Today, we are joined by Anthony DeMaria from the DeMaria Law Firm, Robert Krutzmer from Self-Insured Schools of California, Eva Chavez, one of my colleagues at the Merced County Office of Education, Dr. Don Ulrich, our Cash Immediate Past Chair, also with Clovis Unified School District, and Jeff Johnson with PBK. And we do have a guest with us, Dr. Mark Johnson, who's going to support the discussion on wellness and health issues along with Jeff later in the presentation. So Anthony, Robert, and Eva, you're up first. Would you please share with us your thoughts on managing risk as we welcome our students back to campuses?
I guess then I step in first. This is Anthony. Can everybody hear me okay? Perfect. Well, it's good to be with you here. The area that I have been asked to discuss, and again, this is Anthony DeMaria. I'm an attorney who represents and defends school districts. The area I've been asked to discuss is the potential liability risks when the students come back to school, what we presume will be in the fall of 2021. Can we avoid the risks altogether? Are there immunities, and what are the risks we're looking at? One thing to point out specifically is I'm not speaking to the employees. We know that the employees themselves have workers' compensation issues and would be a different assessment. What we're talking about is the compulsory education of requiring students to come back into the classrooms, and also third parties who may have access to our classrooms for facilities rentals or coming onto campus when we open them. So with that view, bringing students back into the classrooms, if I could go to the next slide, that's our office here in Fresno. Potential liability for returning to campuses. We have a lot of these questions, and I will answer your questions as I go because this is an emerging issue. Big question is, now that we are being asked to bring employees back onto the campus so that we can have the students come back onto the campus, does that mean we are looking at a liability exposure? We believe the answer is yes, there's a potential liability. To this point, you've had students that are either doing distance learning, coming by to pick up packets, or sometimes I believe you have some food that's being passed out. If you bring students back as part of the compulsory mandatory education, then they're required to come back onto the school campus because it is compulsory. Obviously, there can be exceptions to that if a student is on an independent study plan or some other plan. But we do require the students to participate in their education, so we would require them to come back to campus. And looking at the analysis of all the different ways that this could be viewed from a litigation perspective, what are the exposures? What happens if we have a coronavirus? What happens if actually somebody were to be brought onto our school campus that was infected? We take it from the perspective of what are our obligations to the students to keep them safe while they're on campus for school. I'm going to differentiate for you when the students are there because they're required to be there for classes, and when we have extracurricular activities or we open up the space to community groups, because those are two different issues. I believe the risk to your third parties who come onto campus for extracurriculars or rent the space is much less and can be actually waived and released than it would be for our students, because our students are required to be there under our care. So if you look at the third bullet on this first slide, you have various education codes which tell us that while the students are on campus, they are under our care and supervision, and the schools, all our public schools, have a duty to keep the students safe while they're on our campus. If we bring them back in the fall, we're going to have the duty to make sure that we provide a campus that is safe for them, that they won't be injured and they won't get sick based upon the fact that they're on our campus. And if we go to the next slide. So we have a duty. Students come back to school and we have a duty to keep them safe. My assessment is we're looking at a premises liability type of standard, which is, we know we have public grounds, the public school districts is really under, we give some citations here, but you're really under a duty to keep the premises safe. So we have a duty when the students come back to the classroom to keep our school facilities and really to keep the students, it's more focused on the students. We have a duty to keep the students safe on campus. And if we know of an unsafe condition, we have to cure it and we have to warn that it's there. But the standard for us is not just, do we know a student has the coronavirus, or do we know there was a coronavirus outbreak or exposure on the campus. The duty is, should we reasonably know? Is it foreseeable, or do we have reason to know that it is likely that there may be a coronavirus exposure on the campus? It's a tough standard when we bring the students back. It's tough for the students to really be successful on that, but it's one we have to take into consideration. Do we have reason to suspect that there may be a coronavirus outbreak? Looking at our county by county statistics, I believe every county has had a positive outbreak and that they've had someone with the coronavirus. Numbers are drastically different county by county. Some counties have very limited and are not in the spike or growth. Some have had more. But nonetheless, when you put students into the classroom, there is that potential. Because if you've had one case within your district, there is certainly the potential that you could have more. And given the exposures to the campus when the students are on campus, whether it be food, whether it be visitors, whether it be materials, and the fact that all of our students and staff are mixing outside of the campus coming back the next day, there's a risk. So what do we have to do to mitigate the risk? Well, the first thing is, if we can give an adequate warning, that is very helpful. So the more warnings we can give, very important, whether that be constant, whether it be daily, whether it be an ongoing, I'm pulling up our questions now, whether it be an ongoing warning that we give on robocalls. Those are all risks that we can warn against. In addition to the warnings, we take all appropriate steps to keep the school premises safe, to clean the premises, to make sure we disinfect. And we're at that point, if we have warned properly and we have kept the premises clean, and we have not kept students on the premises when we know that there may be a coronavirus outbreak or we know that there was an exposure, we have a good chance of winning that case. But the question raised is there an exposure? And the answer to that is, I think you are going to have an enhanced duty and there is potentially an exposure. A question is, how is this situation different than a student contracting chickenpox at school? There isn't any liability for the chickenpox. If a student were to come to school with a illness or disease of which we did not know and did not have reason to foresee, then we would not have any risk. So certainly, if we had no reason to suspect that there was any coronavirus on the campus, we took all proper precautions, and somebody happened to have coronavirus despite all of our precautions, I think that would be your same scenario. I think the difference we have between other illnesses that don't show themselves, so students can naturally get a cold, they can naturally get the flu. Certainly that would be a different scenario than us knowing that we've had an outbreak of the coronavirus and bringing students back despite the risk. However, there is a similarity between the two, which is, did you do everything you could to mitigate the spread of that risk? If you did, you should have an excellent opportunity to be successful. Is there a risk? There is a risk. Anytime you're sitting down evaluating whether or not you have taken the necessary steps, you did do everything to recognize the risk and give a warning, there is a risk. A question: how will classroom, multi-purpose classrooms layouts be handled with consideration of a 6-foot radius among desk spaces, work areas, and students? Will mobile type protections be purchased? You know, I'm going to defer that one to later for another speaker, because that is not particularly my area, other than to tell you that if you are able to do those things and comply with all of the guidelines, I think you'll be successful. I do believe that the guidelines will be the standards, and if you follow the standards, that you will likely be successful in litigating any cases that come up that will be for students and third parties. Do you envision districts being required to make structural changes to classrooms to comply with state or CDC recommendations? I believe that, and I envision that the schools will have to comply with the CDE, CDC, and other recommendations, because I believe when the assessment is asked of you, did you do everything that's reasonable? And you can say, yes, we did. And the next question is, well, what did you do? You say, well, we followed these guidelines. Well, the guidelines won't be legal standards, they'll be practical standards. I don't know that that means you'll have to make structural changes at school by school, but if you can't comply with the guidelines because of structural issues, that's a question you have to ask, because it could cause exposure. Excellent questions. I'll try and keep asking them as they come. I want one important point to be made here, because it's kind of a legal question. Is there a potential for exposure, legal exposure, liability? Yes, there is. Do I think that the school districts who do everything they can to comply with the guidelines, take every step to keep a clean school, and give all warnings will succeed and win, get a defense verdict, whatever we want to call it, I believe they will, but there's a question of what we call a summary judgment. Can I get the judge to automatically throw this case out? That's a tougher question. You may have to actually litigate the case for a while to prove up that you did all of these things. Those are the risks. That's what we wanted to go through with the risks. That's how I see the assessment. Right now, if we go to the next slide. One thing is we were asked, do we know of any immunities for the school districts? At this time, looking through the list of immunities we have, off-campus student activities, all of the immunities that we know are in the various education codes. I did not see any immediate immunities that I would say are applicable to the decisions we make in keeping the premises safe. Certainly safe premises is not an immunity issue. Now, you could have the legislature create an immunity for you. And to the extent that that can be lobbied and actually enacted with any of the legislation that is going on right now for the coronavirus, I think that would be an excellent idea. If you're being asked to bring the students back and engage in compulsory education, schools that meet certain criteria should have an immunity. I don't believe at this time complying with the guidelines is an immunity. I just believe you will win if you do so. The next question, the release and waiver. We don't believe that you would be successful if you got students and their families to sign the releases and waivers. I don't know that that's been tested in this criteria, but I do give you an example of releases and waivers in situations where the actual activity is compulsory and not really of choice. They've been thrown out. So if the students are required to come to school, I don't believe a release and waiver of the potential coronavirus they may contract at school is something that will be enforceable, just like daycares cannot get releases and waivers for parents that bring their kids to daycare for the public policy reason being they have to take them to daycare in order to work and they really don't have a choice. What the standard will be is, hey, the student can't release and waive liability for the school providing the education, but unless the student can show that the school disregarded known risks and didn't meet the standards, then the school should not be liable, which I think goes to your one of the questions on other types of illnesses. The student would have the burden, or the parent, or whoever comes in who's a non-employee and contracts the COVID-19 would have the burden of proving that the school district knew of known risks, didn't take appropriate steps to warn, didn't take appropriate steps to protect, and disregarded those risks. And from everything we're talking about, if you do follow the guidelines, if you do keep the school safe, you will have followed all known guidelines. And if you put out appropriate warnings, you should have complied and been successful. The question was asked, let me answer this. How do you quantify how much PPE students and staff are entitled to? Cost of PPE is expensive, and to prepare budget and estimates for the cost of PPE would be helpful to know quantity entitled. I want to make sure I understand the question. If we're talking about staff PPE, that's a different issue. They have workers' comp, and I think there are certain guidelines maybe others will speak about. For students, how do we quantify how much PPE? I think you follow the guidelines. And if the guidelines don't speak to the extent of PPE, those are questions that you ought to ask to get that quantified. If PPE is not in the guidelines, face mask, gloves, and hand sanitizers, then I wouldn't think that it will be an issue. To the extent it is, you need to get clarification. So the question on quantifying it's going to come from those who produce the current standards for you. If I could go to the next slide, and that would be CDE or whoever's giving you the recommended standards.
But Anthony, before you proceed, and this is Tom Duffy, basically what you've said, I believe, is that if school districts are taking all appropriate actions following CDC guidelines, and you were clear to say that these are practical standards, that they are providing sufficient information, warning if that's necessary, and I think that's a pretty strong word, warning if necessary, but that districts will not be completely absolved of any liability, because even if they're following the standards you're talking about and providing parents with sufficient information and taking action if they believe that something is happening, if someone's infected, that they may be shielded because of taking all of these measures seriously and acting upon them, but they still could be sued, and that's something that we say frequently. When I was a school district superintendent, I followed the law. I was still sued. So we will not be immune to a lawsuit. We would be, if we follow what you're talking about, we would put ourselves in a good place to defend. Essentially, is that what you're saying?
Tom, I think that's exactly what I'm saying. I appreciate you clarifying that. Exactly. There are certain matters where we know as a matter of law, if we do A, we will get a summary judgment and that case will be dismissed. I don't see the coronavirus as that scenario. I see the coronavirus as a scenario where if we do everything correctly, we can win that lawsuit and maybe win on the summary judgment, but it's going to be a question of fact as opposed to a question of law. Because the legal issue is, did you foresee and do everything? And those are facts that you're going to have to back up. But you still could have a suit brought against you that you may have to defend. That is the current state of how I am seeing this. And when you look at what are the facts that you really had to meet, I think it's meeting all the standards that are in place at that time and looking at the risks in your particular community. You had asked a question, Tom, about the strong word on the risks. I just want to follow up on the warnings. Was there a question on the warnings?
There wasn't. I was just underscoring that if a school district is providing a warning, that warning may be we've been in school now for say a month, and the warning may go out. We found a student on the campus that had contracted the virus, and we're letting you know that we're taking these precautions in the event that you want to keep your child home from school for the next foreseeable week or whatever a period of time, maybe 2 weeks. That kind of warning is what I was thinking you were saying.
Yes, yeah, and what I would say to all of our school districts is, when we're looking at, did we take all steps to keep people safe from known or foreseeable risks, there's 2 time frames. Tom just talked about the second one, which is after there's an outbreak. So the first time frame is, we have no reason to believe anybody on this campus has coronavirus or has been in contact with it. At that time, if we're taking all steps and meeting guidelines, we feel very, very confident that we're not going to be liable for any outbreak. Just like the example of the chicken pox that came up. Things happen, kids will get sick. That we feel very confident there. The next question is, how do we react if we find out there is an exposure? And what did we do to actually check with people and make sure there were exposures? Are we taking temperatures? Are we getting daily health accounts? Are we properly warning and talking to parents? If we did, and then somebody says, look, I tested positive, what was our reaction? If our reaction is immediate and appropriate, we contact the families, contact the whole school, take steps to clean, maybe shut down for 5 days, whatever it is we need to do, that is an appropriate reaction for how we respond and keep people away from risks after we have the initial diagnosis. And you can avoid liability both ways, but obviously the response, when somebody tells you they have the coronavirus or they were exposed, at that point, there's no question whether we knew or should have known. We knew, and so we have to act quickly. I do have a question. If we offer distance learning, then in-person is not compulsory. Therefore, it is a choice to be there. Would we have less liability? I agree that you would. I agree that if you offer both alternatives and a student chooses compulsory, you have less liability and perhaps significantly less. But there is one point, and I think it's on the next couple of slides, as I'll move through quickly to get to the next person, that addresses that. But certainly, if you give them the option and they choose to come in, that is an assumption of the risk on the family's part, where they would have had a different option. If I can go to the next slide. This kind of addresses that question. What about non-students? What about those who want to rent the facilities or want to come on for basketball games? I think, first of all, it's voluntary, it's not compulsory. We know that we will have some immunities that apply at that point. We will have some sports activities immunities. We will have the assumption of the risk immunities. And for third-party participants, rentals of facilities, those releases and waivers should be effective. So if somebody rents our facilities and we have everybody sign a release and waiver, those have a very excellent chance of being upheld, and our risk is a lot lower because we're not compelling them to be there. They are voluntarily coming and they are releasing us and waiving liability against us. We're far less concerned about any of those. We can also have additional insured endorsements and specific statements about the coronavirus. So those we feel better about. I do want to address that question. What if we offer a hybrid? Some students can do distance learning, some can come on campus. There is some language that certain voluntary or extracurricular activities are really so compelled that certain protections apply. Now that Lee versus Weissman case I've given you, that's graduation. So the feeling was, yes, graduation's extracurricular, but it's such an important rite of passage that no kid would voluntarily not show up for any general reason. So even though you say it's voluntary, it's a little more compulsive. I don't know how that would come down with telling a student distance learning or on-campus learning. Some of that may involve whether that affects a student's other extracurricular opportunities. For instance, if you call it distance learning and you can't be on a sports team or on student government, that might affect more of a compulsion for the student to come. Just considerations, but overall, absolutely, if a student is given the option and chooses to come on campus, you're in a better position. I think overall, you're in a good position if you enact all steps. One last thing I would bring up, because we were asked potential liability problems on the next slide. We have not seen this really arise yet, and it gets a little over into administrative IEP matters on my next slide, which is our special education students. Are we risking potential liability in 504 lawsuits, or could you have IEP issues if you have a student with a very high accommodations need that it becomes problematic for you to comply with that accommodation based upon the fact that the student is not going to be on campus all of the time, or we can't get the resources there all the time. We hear of districts that are going to go into a grouping, certain students there Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and others Tuesday, Thursday, switching off. Those are very difficult considerations. We have not yet seen any litigation arising out of that, but it's something to watch, and it's something to consider and really work with the families to try and avoid a situation where you might be seen as deliberately indifferent to the needs of a student who needs to be on campus. You can also provide those accommodations off campus as well, so they don't need to come on campus. I just know that's expensive for you. I did receive a question. If our County Office of Education guidance says social distancing is optional, health screens are passive, and masks are encouraged but not required, will it be seen as if this is doing enough? There's conflicting guidance from CDE or COE and county health. What do we follow? Great question. The safest method when you're in one of these lawsuits is to take all of the guidelines that might apply to you and comply with the one that is most rigorous, because you will face some criticism later if you're in a lawsuit by the fact that you had 2 or 3 that might apply to you and you chose to apply to the most minimal. That having been said, if you're talking about guidelines that don't apply to you, that are just recommended in maybe another state or in general and are not specific to county or your Office of Education, then I don't think those will be held to be your standards. But now this is just what I'm giving you there is just it's a general statement overall. If a district calls me and says, look, I've got 3 different guidelines that arguably could apply to me, I'm going to bring the students back in. Am I safe if I say I'm going to follow the most limited? Yeah, you're probably safe, but you're much more safe if you say, I went above and beyond and I followed the most stringent of the 3 that apply to me. And if they don't apply to you at all, then I don't think you have to worry about that. Are there other questions now, or should we save them for later? If no questions now, I'm available. I would just say, and my number is also my number of contact. I think we're on this. I would say this to you. Tom summarized it very well. If you do everything correctly, meet all guidelines, you have a great chance of defeating any claims against you, but it's probably not an automatic, and you're going to have to explain the guidelines you followed. A higher standard for your students than others from the community whom you could probably have an excellent chance of avoiding any liability problems on voluntary facility rentals. Thank you.
Should I go ahead?
Yeah, go ahead, Robert.
Okay. My name's Robert Kretzmer. I'm the director of the Property and Liability Division for the Self-Insured Schools of California, and thank you for being with us today. I hope everybody and your families are doing well. For my segment of the presentation, I know I've got about 15 minutes. What I thought we would focus on is the guidelines issued by the California Department of Public Health, which were posted on Friday, June 5th. So the major part of my presentation will center on those. But on this first slide, I thought it was interesting. I went to the Department of Public Health website on June 8th, and as of then, there are 133,489 total COVID-19 confirmed cases, and they break it down by age on their website. And I thought it was interesting. Ages 0 to 17 account for 8,509, or approximately 6% of the total diagnosed cases in the state. And of course, the demographic we are most concerned with is K through 12. And so I thought that was an interesting statistic. I am not a medical doctor and I am not a statistician, but so I'm going to leave it to the experts to comment further on what the significance of that 6% is. But I hope it means good news. And to the extent that percentage is as low as it is because of the fact kids have been out of school, or because of the fact that mitigation efforts have been made, well, then that tells us the value of those efforts. Going to the next slide. So the Department of Public Health released their guidance on June 5th, 2020. Give the citation, or you can just go to the covid19.ca.gov website, and you can locate the 15 or 16 page document there. In reading the document, I did note that they present the document as guidelines and considerations for purposes of preparing to resume in-person instruction. So that is somewhat vague, but as Mr. DeMaria pointed out in his portion of the presentation, this may become the standard by which we are judged. So we need to keep that in mind. I also want to point out that I'm aware, and I'm sure all of you are aware, that the California Department of Education came out with guidance, and that was posted on June 8th. The Centers for Disease Control updated their guidance. That was posted on May 19th. So in terms of the documents, we here at CISC have been paying the most attention to. These are the three that we are spending most of our time reviewing. And if you can go to the next slide. So in the overview of the document released by the California Department of Public Health, the document asks each district and school site to consider whether staff, students, and families have the tools, information, resources, and ability to successfully adhere to the new measures. That's found on page 2 of the document. So I think that is significant only from the standpoint that it seems to suggest that there is some variability involved in whether or not a particular school site is going to be able to meet all of the requirements. It's going to necessitate collaboration with families, with students, faculty, etc. So I think that's an important piece of this to keep in mind. Next slide, please. On page 4 of the document, the Department of Public Health asks that districts continue to consult with their county health officers who are monitoring and providing advice on local conditions, and suggests collaboration with the district's county office of ed is also encouraged. I know at CISC, to the extent we have received questions to date, one of the first things I always suggest and remind our member districts, we have districts in our pool in 19 or 20 counties in the state. I emphasize that you need to consult with your local Department of Public Health before making any final decisions if you have questions or if the advice you have been given is not clear. So I think that is a safe route to go. In addition, keeping in mind the point Mr. DeMariam made that to be absolutely safe, follow the most stringent of those guidelines. So, but I think it is important to continue to collaborate with your Department of Public Health. Next slide. On page 6 of the document, the Department of Public Health encourages all staff to use cloth face coverings and suggests that teachers can use face shields if available, which enable younger students to see their teachers' faces, obviously. So in reading through the material, it talked about just the importance of younger students being able to see teachers' faces. So although the guidelines for the most part are generalized, there are some specific interesting points brought up in the document that are worth reading, and that was one that I found on page 6. I do have a question in here. Oh, I see Tom Duffy answered. There was a question regarding the age range as to the 6% of the COVID-19 diagnoses that we've seen, and that was 6% makes up the 0 to 17 age range. Next slide, please. Again, on page 6 of the document, the Department of Public Health encourages districts to think of ways to reduce the likelihood of site resources being shared by students. So they give the example of drinking fountains on the campus. Maybe it would be best to shut down those drinking fountains, prevent access to them, and instead have the students use reusable water bottles. So that would be an example of a specific recommendation made by the Department of Public Health that reduces the number of touches on a particular device or apparatus. And that can be found on page 6. And what I'm trying to do is just point out some of the more interesting or more pertinent suggestions made in the Department of Public Health document that would be of value to you as you consider reopenings. Next slide, please. On page 7 of the document, the Department of Public Health recommends that districts encourage limiting the use of shared playground equipment. So again, another specific recommendation made or guidance given in the document. So instead of doing playground activities on equipment, are there other activities such as games that don't require touching that can occupy students' times instead of the monkey bars, swings, etc. So that is another way of thinking about recess time, lunch break time, etc. Next slide, please. On page 8 of the document, the Department of Public Health encourages districts to pay attention to minimizing contact between students, staff, families, and the community at the beginning of the day and at the end of the school day. And as we all know at our school sites, that is a perfect time for large groups of people to congregate and, in this case, risk contamination. Pre-COVID-19, of course, that was considered to be a wonderful social time for families to reconnect and talk about the week, etc. But in the environment we are now, it's another consideration for school sites. Of course, a great deal of attention is going to be paid as the school day begins and during curriculum instruction until the end of the day. But the Department of Public Health is saying be mindful of that before school starts and after school ends time, that those immediate time periods, because that's when you'll see a lot of congregation of students and family. Next slide, please. On page 12 of the document, the Department of Public Health reiterates the importance of knowing the COVID-19 symptoms. Originally, when the symptoms came out and were published, the symptoms were limited to fever, cough, shortness of breath, or difficulty breathing. Then I believe, and I don't remember the exact date in May, but the Centers for Disease Control published an extended list of symptoms. And that is when I saw the symptoms added of chills, repeated shaking with chills, muscle pain, headache, sore throat, and a new loss of taste or smell. So just be aware of the updated symptoms that have been listed by the Centers for Disease Control, and you'll find that listing also in the Department of Health document on page 12. Next slide, please. So under liability considerations, and from where we sit here at CISC in the Property and Liability Division, we know that should a claim for damages be presented against a district, they are going to be referring that claim to CISC for handling. So one thing we want to advise our districts within our pool is that it's important to check with your administrative counsel starting now to obtain their opinion as to how the California Department of Public Health release of June 5th, the California Department of Education release of June 8th, and the Centers for Disease Control release of May 15th are going to be interpreted. And you've gotten the advice from Mr. DeMaria, who is one of CISC's lead panel counsel, by the way. And so we're going to want to be sure that our districts have had that discussion with their administrative counsel as to not only how are these guidelines to be interpreted, but to what extent it would be a good idea to advise your administrative counsel to what extent the district is following the guidelines and to what extent your district may have difficulty in following the guidelines. So for example, the Department of Public Health guidelines have a consideration or guideline for taking of students and staff temperatures before they come on the premises. So it is my understanding, and maybe others can speak to this in more detail, that the Office of Emergency Services will be providing thermometers and for school sites, and masks for students, for public education students in the state of California. My understanding right now is that the Office of Emergency Services is going to be providing 4 thermometers per school site. So depending on the size of the school site, and I don't know the guidelines well enough or what OES is providing to know if there's any variation, but 4 thermometers per school site for a small school obviously is going to be much more manageable. For a larger school. Here in Kern County, it's not untypical for our high schools, for example, grades 9 through 12, to have populations anywhere from 1,200 to 2,500. Are 4 thermometers going to be enough to be able to take all of the students' temperatures coming onto the campus for any particular day? In terms of the masks, it's my understanding that OES is providing 4 masks per student, and that there will be 2 cloth masks and 2 paper masks provided for each student. And we all know, I think it's pretty safe to say, grades K through at least 8 or 9 are going to have some difficulty retaining their masks for whatever length of time we're in this time period of being concerned about COVID-19. So those are some of the considerations that I wanted to point out. And next slide, please. Coverage considerations. For us here at CISC, this is a major concern. So for example, we have a claim for damages presented, tendered to the CISC Property and Liability Division office for handling. What does our liability memorandum of coverage say? Are there any exclusions in the memorandum of coverage for example, organic pathogens? And is COVID-19 or the novel coronavirus considered to be an organic pathogen? You're going to have to check with your Joint Powers Authority or your commercial insurance carrier to determine how they, number one, whether or not there's an exclusion in the policy for damages resulting from exposure to an organic pathogen. You're going to have to check with the insurance provider to determine how they define organic pathogen. And if you discover that that exclusion does exist and that a virus is included in the definition of organic pathogen, you're going to have a discussion with your insurance provider as to what their intentions are going to be should your district receive a claim for damages from a third party alleging that they contracted the novel COVID-19 due to exposure to the novel coronavirus. And that is going to be an important discussion that probably should start taking place now. So historically, it's my understanding that it really was as a result of the SARS and MERS viruses back in 2005, 2006, 2007, that led to commercial insurance carriers, including the exclusion for organic pathogens in the commercial markets. So this is not something that is new in the commercial markets, but no one has really paid attention to it, including myself here at CISC, until now, because now we are faced with that exposure. As you all probably know, for the last few years, public entities have been dealing with the major concern we've had has been the exposures due to sexual abuse and molestation claims. And that has caused a lot of commotion within the excess insurance markets, particularly here in the state of California. Well, on the heels of that, now comes the COVID-19 exposures. in addition to the exposures related to all of the disastrous fires that we have had here in the state. So the last 5 years have been quite interesting for joint powers authorities as well as commercial excess insurers. And this is only going to make times even more interesting as it pertains to premiums and rates going forward. I might also
Bob,
mention that.
if I could interrupt, Tom Duffy again.
Sure, Tom.
During that time when you mentioned SARS and MERS and what was happening with the commercial insurance companies, were there claims for those that were aware of? And if there were, how were they handled? I asked that question obviously because you mentioned this, but I'm thinking the way you approached it, that this wasn't something that you dealt with at CISC because you didn't have to.
That's correct. And Tom, I honestly don't know what position the insurance carriers took. We at CISC never were presented with a claim concerning SARS or MERS. And by the way, to date, we have not been presented with a liability claim resulting from exposure or contracting COVID-19. Now on the work comp side, yes, our work comp side is dealing with those claims as we speak. But on the liability side, no such claims have been presented. So I'm doing some checking around weekly just to find out if other JPAs or our excess insurer has received those claims. And to date, I have not heard of any liability claims. So that's a good question, Tom, and I just don't know the answer to that one.
Thank you.
Yeah. Now, one thing I will comment on as well is some of you have read or heard that on the first party side, on the property side, there have been claims presented for business interruption losses. The position that the commercial carriers have taken, as well as most of the joint powers authorities that I know of throughout the state, is that a business interruption loss is not covered. And the requirement on any property claim, as you may know, is that there must be evidence of physical damage or direct physical loss to the property. And the existence of the virus on a surface, whether it be personal property owned by a district or the surface of a building, a door, for example, does not represent direct physical loss or physical damage to that structure. So the position being taken by joint powers authority as well as commercial insurers is that that loss is not covered. So I just wanted to share that on the property side as well. And I know my time is just about up, so I'll go ahead and move on to the next slide. So in summary, I just think it's important to be very familiar with the California Department of Public Health release of June 5th, as well as the California Department of Education release of June 8th, and the Centers for Disease Control release of May 15th. And I wanted to concentrate on the Department of Public Health release during this presentation because I think in terms of the reopening of schools, it provides possibly the most detailed guidance. I would also just recommend that you consult with your administrative counsel regarding their interpretation of the CDPH release, the CDE release, and the CDC release for the implications with respect to potential liability exposures to your district. And then, yes, third point, check with your district's insurance provider as to how they intend to respond to the tender of a claim for damages or suit. That's where the coverage issues come into play. So I hope this has been helpful, and I continue to wish everybody good health. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. So Eva, we now have Eva Chavez, and Eva is with the Merced County Office of Education and a CISC board member. And Eva works in the area of human services. And Eva, we welcome you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Yes, so thanks to Bob, and because I'm a CISC board member on both the property and liability and the health benefits, he thought having a practitioner's perspective this morning could be good. I know there may be some other practitioners certainly on the panel. But so what I'm going to share with you this morning are just some of the things we've been dealing with here as we're all grappling with the question of how to reopen school sites and offices safely. Let me set my timer so I can try to stay within the 15 minutes. Maybe you'll be lucky and I'll be even shorter than that, because I think we're sort of exceeded our time here. So what you've already heard from both Anthony and Bob related to guidance, I think many of you will agree that guidance abounds right now. Every time we turn around, we're receiving another guidance document. In fact, when Superintendent of Schools Thurman released the guidance, I think it was this Monday, one of the things he said right in there and in the press release was that it is guidance. So everybody that's releasing is making it clear to us that it's based on science in some cases, based on best practices, but certainly they're not saying that it's something we must do. But for all the reasons we've already heard, we would be wise to look to that guidance so that when we prepare to return, we are following something that we can point to and that is solid. So there's two things that for me have emerged as we've looked at getting ready to reopen. And the two things, and I think we're seeing it play out today, is this theme of guidance versus mandate. Some confusion, I think, rightfully so, may exist out there that what do we have to do? Which one of these things do we follow? And what must we do? And then the second theme that's emerged is that local plans and then, as you've just heard from Bob, plans as it relates to bringing students back. And then, of course, there's the instructional plans and the requirement that school boards approve those, or in the case of a county office, a county superintendent approve those instructional plans. So guidance versus mandate and many plans. That's the world that we're currently living in. That's at least how I've sort of summarized where we are. So at this county office, we decided to begin trying to get back to the new normal, because we know it's not going to be the way it was before, and that's fine. I especially want to say I think it's fine as it relates to student instruction. I think some good things could result from this. So we decided then to start the return to the office, staying away from the classroom right now, by recalling what we refer to as our MSC group, Management, Supervisory, and Confidential, the non-represented staff. And we asked them to return to the office effective Monday, which was June 8th. So in preparation for that, of course, we're having, like you, many conversations, many discussions. Are we ready? What do we need to do? So you've just heard from Anthony and Bob as it relates to students. What do you need to do before you bring back students? Similarly, much of what you've already heard applies to employees, but under the umbrella, of course, of what's the requirement there. Well, I'd like to start by the requirement there is as it relates to California Code of Regulations Title 8, and it's the Illness Injury Prevention Plan. So most of you may already be aware that employers are supposed to have that. We in schools are supposed to have an IIPP. That's been in existence for many years. But like with many other plans, it doesn't mean we're necessarily communicating it. In the world of HR, we communicate that to staff as we onboard them. But then, as you know, we move on and we may not revisit that. Well, given what we're facing right now with the virus, we are needing to say time out. We need to develop what we're calling an IIPP addendum. This addendum is very specific to COVID-19. And we've developed it for us here, through the advice of the guidance that we've received, but also through the advice of our consultant that helps us in our JPA for workers' comp. So we have one JPA here at the County of Merced, which I think nearly every district is a member of. So local control JPA for workers' comp, and we have a consultant who advised us on, hey, as you all start thinking about bringing staff back, you need to think about creating an IIPP addendum. So of course it's like, okay, what's that? She gave us a couple of examples. We ran with it and we've developed one. It still needs a lot of refining, but we were under pressure to have something put together and sent out to this MSC group before this Monday. So we sent all that out, and if anyone is interested in seeing what it looks like, again, be kind. It's a work in progress, but you can find it on the Merced County Office of Education homepage. And so we call it our little packet that we sent out to employees. We linked them to this. We asked that they read carefully, actually, the IIPP, the addendum specifically for COVID before coming back. We asked them to sign off that they acknowledged receipt of it, all because of, well, number one, we want to keep employees free from contracting the virus at work. We want to keep them healthy. That's an obligation, not only morally, but legally. We have this obligation to keep them safe before we're calling them back to work. So again, going along with the theme of our obligation, what are we required to do? We're required to do that. So I know sometimes we focus on kids, and rightfully so. I tend to do that too, protection for students. But in this instance, it was timeout, protection for adults as you think about bringing them back to protect students. So we know that Governor Newsom signed an order which created a presumption of a positive, that we are going to own it, the workers' comp. Just to be clear, we're going to own the workers' comp if somebody turns out to have a positive diagnosis after having been at work. So we bring them back to work. Within 14 days, they get sick, then it's on us. So if they can show that they were at work within 14 days of when they got sick, we're going to own it. Or own it meaning, as Anthony talked about in the world of students, if there's a suit, in our world, if somebody files a workers' comp claim. So although we're putting in all these precautions, we're required to in an effort to mitigate those employees from getting sick. If they do get sick, having been at work, then it's going to be a workers' comp claim. So we want to keep those costs, and what I mean by cost is the cost of their health, which is even more important than the cost of the claim, perhaps hospitalization, treatment, heaven forbid, worst case, somebody passes because they contracted it. So all of that we need to think about as, what do we do to keep them safe? So the RIIPP, if you go to visit it, you'll see it includes a lot of what you've already seen in regard to posters, the signage, the couple of OSHA visits that I've heard of in other parts of the state. OSHA's looking for, where is the guidance for employees? What did you give them before you brought them back? What does your signage look like? Where's the hand sanitizer? More importantly, soap and water. They have access to that. Are you requiring face coverings, or are you just making it a recommendation? We were starting off with, let's strongly recommend. Well, in no time at all, we got to, let's require, because again, our obligation is such that if somebody then comes to us and say, well, you didn't do anything to protect me when I came back to work. We want to be able to say, we did do what the guidance suggested. So requiring face coverings, of course, if you require something for an employee, you provide it. In this case, we're needing to provide face coverings, although many employees are choosing to bring their own cloth ones versus the paper that we've provided. The document also includes, of course, areas of self-assessment. So many of you have already heard about, are you requiring employees to do self-check before they come to work? Or are you requiring them to undergo a temperature check when they get to work? Well, and with that one, because we don't believe we have the capacity to do the employee temperature once they come to work, we chose to say self-check. So every morning they're to complete the self-check form. They fill out before they come to work. It asks them a series of questions. The questions we obtain based on the guidance from the CDC, from OSHA. What kinds of questions are you asking? There still is no substitute for judgment. They are ultimately going to have to rely on their own judgment as to whether they need to answer yes to one of those questions. So the question asks about cough. Okay, some people might have a cough, but they know that allergy season creates this cough. It's ultimately going to be up to them whether they say, yes, I'm not coming to work. And of course, they need to follow the protocol for reporting to work. Just because they fill out the self-assessment form doesn't mean they don't have to follow their obligation to report it. We are.
And Eva, can I interrupt you for a second and ask, is the self-assessment form something that is done electronically and submitted then to the office prior to the employee coming to the job site? Or
Yes,
is it done differently?
No, that is what we did. And again, talk about having to move at warp speed to make that happen. We're very paper driven still, but we did work with our IT department. So thanks to them, we were able to develop, I guess it's a Google form that employees fill out. So like in my case, I have it on my screen of my iPhone. So every morning before I leave my house, I touch it, I fill it out. I have to enter my name, my employee ID number, answer the questions, hit submit. It automatically sends me a copy. It gets stored. So we're not killing trees, having everybody print these forms. It's stored, much like with any other kind of liability issue, just in case, right? We're not asking everybody to submit it, but we are asking departments to check to make sure that it is being submitted. So we've granted access to one person in each department to go on every day and look at their department staff who are back. And remember, right now, the size of the group is relatively manageable. We're doing all of this sort of as a test run so that when we do bring people back that are closer to kids, it's more people, then we've got it down, right? That's our plan. Is to have, we can have digitally stored the same way. The acknowledgement that employees read the IIPP addendum is also being stored. In that case, we're doing it through Laserfish, also through our IT assistance by our IT department. So everything, we're trying to do it efficiently, but keeping in mind that no one has time to be bombarded with a bunch of pieces of paper. So I'm going to move on. I have just a couple minutes left on the other part of what I wanted to touch upon, which has to do with negotiations. So yes, we know there's a mandate, we're required, we're obligated to enter into negotiations with our exclusive representatives for those various topics that are likely going to come up, and we've already heard many of them that surfaced even today, as it relates to employees and their right to bargain. So we chose not to do the temperature takes just because, again, the advice I've received from the council that I use for negotiations is you need to advise the union, put them on notice if you intend to require employees taking their temperature at work, which was going to take us down that path. We said, no, we think we can handle it by asking them to take their own and to fill out the form every day. So we're looking for ways, if you don't have to go there and you can still say you have a relatively safe work environment, then that's the route we chose to go. But when it comes to bringing back teachers, and you might get into the various topics about that are negotiable, and many of you know those already, but class size with social distancing in effect, you know, what does that mean? And you're going to need to negotiate over that because class size is an enumerated subject, even though under this scenario, we're probably talking about fewer kids, not more kids. But work days and their schedules. So are they going to be teaching kids in person Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday prep, Thursday, Friday, possibly distance learning? Now you're talking about a different forum for which they are going to have to be prepared, perhaps leading to more prep time. Again, negotiable subject. Enhanced health and hygiene, the whole thing about taking their temperature or any other clearance measures that we're going to require them when they return to school. The whole notion of cleaning and sanitizing, are we asking them to do more of it? They're going to take more of their time. What exposure might there be for them? We often talk about course and scope of someone's employment. For teaching staff, cleaning usually isn't within course and scope of employment for them. So we need to think about that. And are we creating some liabilities that we normally wouldn't create? And then the whole continuation of remote teaching and learning, the blended approach. Some districts are saying we're going to have some teachers that are going to be focused on teaching the kids who survey says many parents may want to keep their kids. We're hearing in our county 20 to 30% are saying, no, I'm not going to have my child come back. I don't feel comfortable. So we need to have a match, if you would, kids who need distance learning with which teachers will be the distance learning teachers. Hopefully it isn't just the ones that say, I don't want to come back because I have a health condition. But instead, we might come up with a different way now to say we're going to need X number of distance learning teachers. Of you in our pool now, how many of you are interested in doing that? And approach it that way and try to go through the process now. But again, you might need to negotiate over that because you already have policy, maybe collective bargaining language related to how teachers are selected to fill positions. So you heard my timer go off. I don't want to take the next person's time, but you can find me if you go to the Merced County Office of Education website and look in the Human Resources Department, and you can obtain my contact information there. So thank you for the opportunity.
Oh, and we have Julie back.
Okay.
Hey, Eva, thank you. That's wonderful. God, just so much going on. It's just amazing to think about that. All right, next up, we've got Don Ulrich, and he's going to talk about school opening risks for student staff, assumptions, considerations, and expectations. Hi, Don. How are you doing?
Good morning, Julie, and good morning, everyone listening in and watching in, I guess. Julie, let me ask, I know a lot of great information, so we're a little behind schedule. What would you like me to try to stick to as far as the timeline to maybe get us back on track?
You know what, Don, we just want to hear from you.
Okay.
Give us the full Don.
All right. Well, I will try to be a little more brief, but my position in Clovis Unified is I'm the deputy superintendent, and we have one deputy superintendent, and we're about a 43,000 student school district near Fresno. And I only give you that background because I want to give you the context of what I'm speaking to from a overall district operational point of view. All the major divisions in our district report to me, so it's really an operational position. And I serve the superintendent in that mode. And I just want to frame today what were some of the assumptions, some of the risks we're worried about, some of the operational details we're starting to put in place, and maybe some of the processes we're using to navigate this. And if we can go to the first slide, and even the next one after that. One of the big things for us in Clovis Unified is we wanted to maintain our focus through all this challenge, chaos, whatever you want to call it. And our focus always is on student learning. So to do that, we had to think about a few things right off the bat, just from a leadership point of view, as we started to process this. And that was, that commitment to student learning, and then being empathetic and communicating a vision of safety, right, with quality instruction. Because we're going to have many families, as you've heard, and I'm sure you're experiencing, you're going to have many staff members that have a fear of varying degrees, right? The joke I like to say, or maybe it's not a joke, it's an experience, right, is my wife and I go home and we watch the news, and she leans a little more towards CNN, and I lean a little more towards Fox News, if that makes sense. So we have a completely different viewpoint of what the risks are. And I think our whole society is dealing with that. So my point is, you have to be empathetic to all people when you're a public school district about what that vision of safety is, balanced with quality instruction. So that's a vision we have too to deal with this. And then lastly, and I'll emphasize this again at the end, but just a sense of teamwork, empathy, like I said, and a can-do spirit. Try to lead from that platform with everybody, I think really help. On this, because that's what we're going to have to do. So if you go to the next one, please. As far as safety protocols, just recently what we're kind of discussing with our health department is, can we go to a square foot per student for social distancing? And that's just our desire to maintain instruction. It's very difficult if it's 4, 6 feet, whatever it's going to be as their final guideline, to keep kids 6 foot apart, 4 foot apart, especially our younger kids, continually. So does the square foot idea give us a little more leeway to do instruction like we normally do, and balance that with health screening? We feel like if we can get more guidance on what kind of health screening we could do from a liability point of view, help with temperature gauges and thermometers and those kind of things to do some type of testing. Is there some type of funding for more nurses on staff to really have a robust screening system? We feel like parents and constituents will be more relaxed in bringing their kids back to school with us and feeling safe. And then I want to kind of segue into what we're really thinking about as far as safety is, how do we balance safety and social distancing with current instructional pedagogies? And really, I'm in my 39th year of education, and for 30 of those, we've been working on moving having instructional pedagogies evolve. So if you go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about that. And this is for those of you that might not have been a teacher or an educator, that probably not too new to you. You probably experienced this if you've been a parent, but definitely if you're on the education side, it's a movement towards teacher as facilitator, a lot of student problem solving, discovery, active inquiry, students working in groups on projects, and then flexible time and workspaces. And I know facility people are definitely in their designs or trying to design spaces that are more flexible, a lot of places for kids to work together, those kinds of things, a lot of movement. So those really are in such opposition to what we're hearing from the health department and the science of not spreading this disease. So those are just challenges for us of how can we maintain some of those instructional pedagogies, but still keep our kids safe as far as some of the risks we're concerned about as far as student learning. If you go to the next one. So what does instruction look like in August 2020 for us on June, June 11th of 2020? We have, and this is the process I wanted to tell you about, is just the way we're doing it. We have about almost 10 subcommittees from various things like, the instructional model, transportation, food service. I think we have one on co-curricular, one on athletics, et cetera, right? Subcommittees working on what it looks like to follow the health guidelines and then reporting back to one big subcommittee. And of course, we're trying to do that through Zoom right now, which has challenges of its own. But here's what we're, I guess where we're at right now, it's still pretty gray. We've committed to our board that by July 15th, we'll have a recommendation that will answer some of these questions. But right now, we'll more than likely be on some type of split schedule. We're assuming that if we have 50% of our students on campus at one time, we can maintain the social distancing guidelines or come close to it that we're seeing. Some blended learning, that means when you're not in school, as a student, you'll have some kind of online requirement and our teachers will be able to deliver that. Flexibility within that for differing parents that have more concern versus others. In other words, some kids could be completely on blended learning, completely online, other kids not. Co-curricular activities, big question mark. Obviously, you know, there's some more determination by our health departments on that, and examples maybe from colleges and in professional sports as far as athletics, and even how choirs, bands, all those kinds of activities, even in the class, congregate. We kind of push the envelope a little bit, and we just started some practices with our summer teams, and the Fresno County Department of Health reviewed it, and it's kind of being used as a guideline for other school districts in Fresno County, where we maintain social distancing. We're actually taking temperatures of all the athletes, those kinds of things that we've modeled for people. And then the last thing I'll say is, and this is what I've heard, by the way, which is very helpful for me hearing our legal people talk about what the liabilities will be, you know, and how do you navigate as a big organization? And from my position is thinking about the whole district and the liability we might take, determining how much we push the envelope. What I mean by that, a guideline, right, is a guideline. And we might have direction from our board that's different than others that says, we want you to get those kids back in school. Let's push these guidelines, right? Well, what I'm hearing from our legal advisors is you push the guidelines too far, and then you're taking greater risk, right? You know, we just heard them say, and that's, I love lawyers, right? They're gonna say, hey, obviously you follow those guidelines to the letter, and that's less risk. Every time you don't follow a guideline, that's more risk. And, or they'll say, you know, it's gonna depend on each one of those risks you take. So it's not easy to navigate that, but I think that's what's in front of all of our districts too, and working with their insurance companies or their joint powers and determining how much risk they're willing to take to get kids back in an instructional mode that they probably know is best for them. And this is where your governing board comes in. How much is your governing board willing to stick, you know, take some risk with their local decision to push the guidelines maybe more than they should, or more than the risk they're willing to take. So those are some of the things we're trying to navigate on determining what it's going to look like in August of 2020 when we open up our schools in some fashion. Go ahead and go to the next one. These are just concerns, right, that don't have a lot of answers for. We have some processes we're going through. You know, well, how many parents will opt out? It was probably 4 weeks to 5 weeks ago now, that national poll that scared the heck out of everybody that said, you know, 60% of our parents are saying they're not coming back. This was a national poll. So we are doing a survey. It's out right now. I'm amazed at we're 43,000 kids, and it's been out for 2 days. And I think we're at 16,000 responses. So we're getting a good response to our online survey on choices parents are thinking about. That's going to help us determine where we're headed. Of course, ADA, right? And here's, you guys probably all know, when the CDE speaks or our superintendent speaks, that means that you're probably going to get those waivers, but it hasn't been in writing yet, right? Our CBO tells me that every day, because Tony Thurman just said in the recent guidelines, we expect that some schools will be on complete distance learning, like kind of, and that's okay. Well, what does that mean for ADA? Our CBO is waiting to hear that definite confirmation that there's going to be some type of waiver. And then, you know, this is the thing, we're facing an 8% funding cut. Worst case now, that could be a lot better for some districts, especially concentration districts, based on the legislative proposal. So we'll see where we go with that. But we're definitely in our district, because we're not a concentration district, we're going to face some type of funding cut from our 2021 school year. So how do we navigate increased costs with funding cuts, right? That's a concern. You know, and then the funding from the feds, which is, of course, up in the air still, that's part of the California budget negotiation, is will that come to fruition or not? And then we've talked some about district liability and where we are with that. So let's go to the next one, Sam. These are some of the specific ones for us that I know, I think I heard it talked about once in the special ed, and then a lot, of course, in the previous presentations on infections and for students and staff, and what does that mean for liability. So that's kind of been covered, but I want to focus on the one with students with special needs. I think if you're an educator, you know that IEPs are a legal document that you're held accountable for as an education organization, and much more so than regular ed. And so our concern of liability is during this time we've been distance learning in the last 3.5 months, especially students with more severe modifications, and they don't meet their goals coming into the future. There's a concern by a parent, what is our liability? And for compensatory education, which is just means we have to compensate the education, very costly for school districts when they lose those cases. So how are IEPs going to be held accountable? And we haven't heard any definitive answers yet. We're working with our SELPAs, other SELPA districts across the state of California and even in the nation to see if how we're going to get some guidance on that. What we need is some waivers, frankly, from the state of California, but that's very difficult with the advocacy that special needs students have. That's where the pushback's coming. And so that's another concern liability-wise that could be costly for districts when they have students that claim that they didn't get the services they needed, and the district's liable for that. Thus, compensatory education, lawyer fees, et cetera, that we're concerned about. The COVID infections, like I said, we really haven't talked a lot about that yet. That's why I really liked hearing the perspectives from our legal analysts that have talked today. And that's a big one for us that we need to talk more. I know I've talked one time with our CBO about it, and he's getting the information he needs from our JPA, ASCIP, to see where we're going to be at. But I think that liability discussion will drive how much risk you take in following guidelines when you open up in August. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. So just some conclusions here. I think that the big one for me, again, and I'm come from an education background. We're an education organization. So from the superintendent's office, it's about, how do we maintain our learning culture? Because we're still, that's our mission, and we want to do that whatever environment we're in as best we can. And then this is something, the next bullet, what can we do as opposed to what can't we do? And that was just a leadership mantra that our, myself, our superintendent, when we came back on, I think it was March 15th and school was closed, and we met with our leadership team of principals and administrators, probably about 150 people. And we went in the gym and kind of spread out as best we could because we wanted to see each other. And that's what I started off my talk with is, let's not get hung up on what we can't do. Just get your teams focused on what we can do. And that's what we've done. I'm proud of our organization and the distance learning we got on top of real quick. And then other activities we did that have been well received by our parents. And I'm just trying to show you when you maintain that culture of can do, what can happen. We had our graduations, they're just finishing up this week. We went 1 week after school, one of our high schools. And we did it individual appointments, right? Every 5 minutes, graduates coming in their robe, their principals meeting them. And we made just a beautiful backdrop that really simulated what it looks like for graduation. And just our high schools did such a good job of making it a classy event, is what we're known for in Clovis for our graduations, that heck, our parents and are just as excited or more excited because they get more individual attention, right? So we really made that work in this environment, which was the kind of things we want to do when we start next year instruction-wise. A lot of initiative in the classroom, a lot of initiative at our school sites to do what they can do as opposed to what they can't. And then I think the big thing is going to be, working together, teachers, staff, students, community, you know, the partnerships happen and collaboration happens when, again, your attitude is about what can we do together, talking, communicating, what's going to work. Those are the powerful conversations of communication that happen when you're truly collaborating. And that's what it's going to take. It's going to take leadership and that kind of working together as a community to get through this the best we can. The last thing I'll add, and I think Eva talk about it a little bit, was that school districts, I think, have an opportunity. Is most school districts now are considering bringing their district office staff back, right? And we're just right in the middle of that. We're doing a transition week this week with our start date of June 15th. And boy, are we learning a lot about the adults and the fear factor and the concern factor and the right PPE and the right signage and the right directions to make people feel safe. And that, you know, like everything, just took, for some people, just those individual conversations, empathy. We're going to keep you safe. Try us out. You know, that's what this week's about. Try coming to work. Look at the signage we have. Look at the requirements for masks when you're in the hallways and walking about. And that's what I think you can use as a school district to say, okay, how did it work bringing, in our case, 250 adults back to the main office, the district office? What did we learn from that when we bring back, in our case, 43,000 kids and 2,000 teachers in 7 or 8 weeks? So that's just the assumptions we have and some of the things we're considering to open up a 43,000 student school district, like I said, you know, August 17th. So thank you. That's it for mine.
Thank you, Don. That was really very helpful to hear what you're going through, and that you have a deadline that you've set for your board and your community. Yeah. And as we frequently say, school districts are bound to their calendars. Parents look toward calendars, teachers look toward calendars, everyone, because the calendar drives what we do. And you are trying to abide by that, I think, in what you're planning and how you're trying to make assessments. And one of the things that we like to say about surveys, and you're doing a survey, is that a survey is not only there to gain information from people, it's to give them information. By virtue of the fact that you are doing the survey, you're conveying to them that you care about what they think, and certain parts of that survey, and I certainly haven't seen it, but certain parts of that survey are going to give them some significant clues as to what the district's intentions are. Yep,
we talked about that even, Tom, in the wording of the questions. We came to that conclusion as we were putting it together, that we were almost as much as communicating with our parents about what we were considering, as well as asking for their opinion.
Well, thank you, Don. And we will now move on. We have an exciting presentation from Jeff Johnson. Jeff Johnson is an architect with PBK Architecture, and he has a special guest with him, Dr. Mark Johnston. And Dr. Mark Johnson just happens to be his brother. He is able to share his insights as a doctor and in the work that he does. And so I'll stop, Jeff. You and your excellent presentation are what we await. And don't worry about time. Looks like we've got about 40 minutes left, and we'll conclude without any problem.
Okay, great. Can everyone hear me all right?
You're good. You got a good, strong voice.
All right, great. Well, thanks for allowing us to be a part of what CASH is doing. And thank you, Don Ulrich. Very insightful. And as we walk through this, we're starting to navigate this new norm. We're having to pull out all the stops and do things that we've never done before, or in multiple ways in this collaborative idea. So the idea that us coming together like this is perfect. And so next, I can probably skip the next one too. That's me. And so navigating this new normal, everybody's been disrupted on so many different levels. And here we are at a conference doing it digitally, and all these meetings that we've been having, we've had to shift things up quite a bit. So as we navigate this, we're discovering a lot of things that we're trying to come back to normal. So the idea that it's almost like we're deconstructing the status quo and hopefully rebuilding something new that maybe is even better. So as Dr. Ulrich had mentioned that the idea of a student, it's all about them. How do we keep our focus around them and look at deadlines that we're trying to meet and keep them in great, healthy environments? So next, we start to look at just some of the basic, the next slide. So I'll quickly go through some of the things that presented last time, and it was really just more basic research relating to architecture, and as a kind of refresher. So essentially, we're looking at essentially 4 elements. The social aspect, we've heard many comments about how do you get people in one environment. It's about surfaces. What is on those surfaces? Is it cleanable? Is it washable? And they're in many different arenas. It's technology. Are there ways that we can have technology work for us where we limit the amount of surface contact? And then for air is a major thing because of these particulates and contagions being airborne or on surfaces, that how do we keep fresh air and maintain a healthy environment? And when you start to look in between those, all these logistics of being able to screen kids coming in beforehand or while they're here and washing. And then can we automate things? And then the very important part is the ventilation. So all these things are kind of all out there in the air. There's a lot of information. So these events are trying to simplify them down to the basic elements. And I'll just walk through some those details quickly. So next, one of the social is that just looking at separation. So we have bathroom areas and looking at where how separation can actually happen, or entering a restroom. Maybe they don't have doors. So there are some more long-term and there are some more short-term. We're looking at dining. How does that happen throughout the cafeteria? Also, if someone is ill or is found to have positive, what's the procedure for that? Are there spaces to be able to provide a safe place for the remaining students and for that student? Next slide. And so with that is the spacing. How does it work within the classroom itself? So there was a question about spacing, that it's from desk to desk. So as Donald talked about, going to 50% is a likelihood. Is it using other spaces that aren't typically used? Do you have to break down buildings into wings, or do students stay within the classroom to limit the amount of exposure they have throughout the entire school? Do teachers rotate? There's a lot of questions on just these issues. And then about like signage. How does it become a graphic thing where it's almost a campaign? You're having to change mindsets and behavior. Next slide. And so with some of the surfaces is there's entry, looking at someone at the front desk or reception. How are they protected? A mask can only go so far. Again, with like the restrooms, can they be hands off? But handrails, are there materials that we use? And a big one will be furnishings. What kind of surfaces? Are they porous enough they actually hold contagions? How cleanable is it? Can doors be automated or by foot, washing, these kind of things? The next slide. And a big part is the air and light, is that our system's capable of providing the amount of fresh air and flushing out a building in time. Is there natural ventilation that happens? And what's the timing of filtration? So there's a lot of questions as to what you can do short-term and long-term. Can you night flush a building to at least get fresh air once a day? And next slide. And then are there natural ways? more short term. The idea of outdoor classrooms, the idea that contingents are actually 80% are killed by UV exposure, and outdoor having natural fresh air. So is it the possibility that we can have improved the quality of education, and maybe it's outside or inside, or maybe that's a way to divide your classes. So there's a lot of opportunities. And also natural elements, biophilia, where you can filter air in a natural way that actually enhances the environment. Next slide. And so for technology, it might be a little bit more of a long term, but how does it work for handless washing and drying? A lot of schools already have those. Those might be a simple transition. Automatic door opening, whether it be at the front entry or even classrooms. But then how does that work for food service delivery? Are these pre-packaged? Is there a screen wall? Is that provided in a different way than we typically have done before? And next slide. And so as we start to put this together, we start to see that even just for a classroom, it becomes a challenge with the operable windows. Is the natural daylight. You have daylight coming in to be able to provide a safe place, hand washing within the classroom, distance between the furniture. Acrylic panel that encapsulates the student at their desk to allow closer proximity. A lot of options and a lot of kind of a menu of choices and directions and pathways to actually take. So at this point, these are things that we presented last time, and I think there's some questions about gym and locker rooms. That's a great question. With lockers, that's a surface and also proximity for kids to get to those. A lot of schools have already started taking their lockers out because of that simple issue. How do you time? And also taking out the lockers allows you more space within the corridor to give you better distancing. And then you could actually have maybe a two-way corridor, or maybe they're all one way, where you don't have, or you limit the amount of contact, potential contact, and air disruption. Yeah, so there's a lot of questions on social distancing and many different arenas. And I think this is maybe we can cover some of these questions at the end, and Dr. Johnson will actually have a chance to chime in. So I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Mark Johnson. He's a doctor, oncologist in infectious diseases, but he's also a CDC regional director in Chicago and adjunct professor at University of Illinois for public health. And like Tom mentioned, he's my brother. And I think our mom would be proud that we're finally working together. It just took a pandemic to actually make it happen. So it's been interesting having a conversation with the two of us that we've never had to have before. So without further ado, Dr. Johnson.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I do want to be clear, though, even though I do work as a CDC employee, I'm not here as a representative of the agency. I'm here to really support the discussion with Jeff on how we use design and health in assessing and dealing with a crisis like we're dealing with now. So I want to be clear that I'm not here as an official spokesperson, more to kind of provide my professional perspective on this issue. Next slide. So you've already heard a lot about some guidance that is out there, and I'm not going to reiterate those, but obviously CDC has guidance for school administrators. It was given out recently. California Department of Public Health, as was mentioned just last week, provided an update in their guidance. Also, it was mentioned is the California Department of Education has their guidebook that came out earlier this week. They're all dealing with COVID issues and providing information for school systems and parents and teachers about how to respond to this issue and keep students safe. I appreciate the comments from Eva and Don about the distinction between guidance and mandates, because guidance is really just that. It's recommendations based on the best science we have available to us, as well as best practices in our experience. But it's not really a static process. This is really something that is iterative. And I think one of the things that would really be beneficial as your continuous discussion through webinars and other interactions is to provide some feedback to health agencies about your experiences, so that the information that we get from you can be used then to refine and improve those guidance in the future. So I think it's really important to have open lines of communication based on how effective these guidance documents are to you, so that we can continue to improve that information. And also I've included a couple of other, I guess we refer to as more longer term implementation. One of them is from US EPA, has an indoor air quality tools for schools guidance that focuses on sort of general air quality, whether it's related to HVAC systems, to mold, related to pest management, and just improvement to reduce the risk of respiratory disease in kids, including asthma. So I would draw your attention to that as some additional guidance to consider. And the last one is sort of a thought process, and I throw this in here just more for awareness. It's really a very technical document. This is guidelines that CDC has regarding control of infections in healthcare facilities. It's a very detailed document, much more for building engineers and designers. But what I thought was useful, though, in thinking about this is we're considering how to create a safe environment for kids in the future, that maybe there are some best practices and information that can be gleaned from materials like this that are where the healthcare facilities are designed to minimize the risk of infection. And there might be some basic principles from that kind of those guidelines that could also be useful for application in school systems. So I'll throw that out without a specific recommendation that this be something to be viewed as or interpreted as guidance for schools, but certainly a reference or a resource that could be utilized. Next slide. I'm just going to highlight a few of these elements. Robert Kretzberg talked a lot about these, so I won't reiterate what he already covered. This is a snapshot from the CDC interim guidance for schools that shows this school decision tree, where based on the information you have available, you might then go through a very different decision process and checklist to address those situations. Starting off at the top about when you have an actual confirmed case in a building, how you assess that, and then how you respond to that. And then the lower left about when you have a situation where there may be no community spread, here are some things that you should be thinking about in terms of continuing to provide education and surveillance to make sure that you can verify when there might be a change in that status. And this is sort of a reminder to mention the really importance, though, of school systems to work closely with your county health officer, because they're really the link between your programs and health agencies at both the state and federal level. So I think it's really important that that partnership be really, and I'm sure this is probably happening as well, so I'm not really hoping not to preach to people who are already practicing this, but to really reinforce that relationship to provide the guidance to you about the status of health in the community. And then to the right of that is cases where you have more evidence for impact in community spread that then define different outcomes and different approaches to deal with that. Again, this is really general information, and the website has a lot of details that I would encourage you to look through and to make your community aware of that this is as a resource. Next one. And then Robert also mentioned about the recent guidance about the California Department of Public Health. And again, the point about making sure you know who your county health officers are and they can provide local guidance. Because as the other thing that I want to emphasize is that guidance is only as useful as it is implemented. And so there needs to be, gets to Don's point about partnerships, that working with your community, your teachers, students, staff, can be important, though, in identifying ways in which you can implement that guidance in ways that require some creativity and some thought about how you implement those practices to comply with the goals of the guidance. So again, just highlight the importance of this resource, which I think is really quite useful to you. Next slide. I mentioned about the EPA guidance. I won't talk about that. There's the web link for those who are interested in that. Again, more of a guideline for building maintenance and engineering practices. The last one. This was the one I mentioned about the guidelines for healthcare facilities. It is very specific and has some elements that I think could be useful for more for long-term planning, for design, for architects to be thinking about how they incorporate practices about surfaces within schools that can allow for minimal disease spread and disinfection procedures and materials in those buildings, as well as air handling HVAC system considerations. Next slide. So one of the things, again, that's kind of put this in a broader perspective, which is what we kind of want to do, this really kind of look at a big picture perspective, that, you know, we work a lot with disaster responses, both natural as well as man-made disasters. And so the first phase is always the sort of the crisis, the initial management of the disaster, to deal with the concerns about health impacts, to make sure that people find safety, search and rescue activities, find shelter, clothing, food, and all the needs that people have during initial phases of disaster. And we're kind of in that phase still. We're dealing with it in terms of surveillance of cases, monitoring the occurrence of symptoms, and then treating people that need that, and then looking in the future towards, as we're looking at reopening schools and businesses and the general economy, looking into a recovery phase, which really has to have a preventive component to it. That we've begun in some part, but we need to sustain that in terms of, that's where I get some issues we've been talking about with regards to social distancing and protective equipment and best practices to reduce the contacts that can lead to further exposures.
Mark, when we had talked before, you know, we were talking about this idea that we're in this unfamiliar zone, and you're more familiar with kind of this crisis and recovery. We had started talking about maybe as a ramping up, you know, as schools are talking about coming back into service and ramping up into that. I thought it was interesting that the idea that we can't just jump, you know, like Dr. Ulrich had talked about, that having a plan and having a schedule. But we had talked about what those steps could be leading up to it that would have better success. You'd mentioned some of the collaboration ideas.
Right. So I think, you know, and that was another point I think that Donald had mentioned about a collaborative effort amongst partnerships. That's really an important part of the phase we're in now, is that we need to be working together to share our expertise, our experience, and support. And that's one of the things we were encouraging. I think that the service you're providing with CASH, with these webinars, I think is really important because it provides a venue for that information exchange to occur and the collaborative efforts to be facilitated. And I think that's going to be something that's going to be required in the future, because we're going to have a fairly long recovery period, I would suspect, with regards to this. It's not going to go away quickly. And the practices that we're talking about implementing need to be sustained and to try to find ways to do that. One of the things my experience also with some disasters, one with Hurricane Katrina, where I spent time along the Gulf Coast in both Mississippi and also in Louisiana, was a interaction that I participated in where local officials in New Orleans were wanting to make sure that students who were in areas that were severely affected by this, where there was sort of long-term multi-generational residents, they were concerned that kids in high school would see this disaster and say, I don't want to live here anymore. We're just going to take off. and they were concerned about the long-term sustainability of that community. And one of the things that they were doing as part of their redevelopment planning is that they very intentionally engaged the community and students in the discussion about what should redevelopment look like? How should we be working together in the future? And we participated in a workshop with students at a local high school where they gave them opportunity for them to have input into what they would like to see in this community happen that would make it appealing for them to stay. I think it was sort of parallels to this here, if we can maybe also think about ways in which engaging students and teachers in how do we implement guidance for social distancing that can be actually practical. And maybe if it comes down to ideas that students come up with that seem to be able to be implemented, they may more likely adhere to that because it was their idea or they contributed to that. So I think that sort of partnership collaborations can be really important for all of us as we move forward.
And that's one thing that that Tom Duffy had mentioned about behavioral transitioning, is that, this is a mind shift, this is a change. And so having some way to a creative process maybe to engage them, and maybe being in the same room with.
If I can step in, Jeff, I really liked hearing what you said, Mark, about the aftermath of Katrina and the fear that young people and so to make sure that they were heard, and I'm sure that there were responses to what they said, engaging them helps not only to hear what they're thinking and to help them maybe be calm and transferring that to this circumstance today. But what we know is that students learn from other students. It begins at the preschool level, kindergarten, all the way. If a student is struggling with reading and they're in first grade, sometimes the help is we put them next to another student and they learn. But the point is that I think students can help us to engage and calm other students if they're anxious, and we hear about some of that. We heard that from our Cash moms, I think last week. But also to have, I think your point, Mark, to have students tell us what will make things work better for you if we're engaging in social distancing and we're asking you to socially distance. So how do we make that happen and make it not foreign, but make it acceptable and become the commonplace thing, because we don't know how long this is going to last. So I think that's a very wise approach, that you taking that technique, process, whatever you want to call it, from the Katrina response and redevelopment, and putting it into the practice of how do we keep kids in school today, making them feel comfortable by having them help us really restructure that social environment.
Right, and I think as students see their peers behaving in a certain way, they will begin to mirror that, and I think it can spread from there. But yeah, the principle of engaging them in the process gives them some sense of connection to it and empowerment that their thoughts, their ideas are being listened to. Yeah.
I was wondering if, Sam, could you take us back to, I think it was slide number 50? Maybe it's 49. 49 probably. No, but it must have been the one before. There we go. So discussions with public health agencies. Mark, I wanted to come back to this because, and I didn't interrupt you when you were sharing it, because we heard clearly from our attorney, Anthony, on the call today, and we heard Bob underscore that what you want to do is if there's guidance that is being given, you want to make sure that you use the guidance that is not the least, but the most effective, or that the most stringent. I think that's the term that Anthony used. So if I follow one of these, am I going to be including all the others? So it is the CDC guidelines at the bottom, and I know you emphasized that slightly differently. Is that inclusive of the top three, or do I gain something strong and impenetrable maybe from the standpoint of keeping kids and adults safe by reading all of these and pulling out what I think are the best means of keeping people safe and protecting, basically the entire school environment. What's your advice here?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can offer a specific response to that question. It's an important one. And, what is the hierarchy of guidance maybe is what you're getting to. And that's why I would emphasize really connecting with your county health official, because they would be most knowledgeable about the situation and what's most applicable and, what's required, what's recommended, than I can provide from my perspective. So I think all of those could be useful. But in terms of prioritization, I think that's where I would look to your local health official for, how to implement those guidance.
And you made me think, we have such a diverse state. California is a unique place. I know you're in Illinois. Hopefully you visit your brother from time to time. But it's a unique place, from the oceans to the deserts, from the north to the south. And it would seem to me that there may be factors that the health departments in the various counties, and we have 58 counties in California, that the various counties may have differing guidelines because of the circumstances within their physical environment, because of weather, what topography does for weather. And that's something I really hadn't considered until I listened to you today. But that would be probably a good message for our school district colleagues that are listening in, that depending upon the county you're in, you may find something different from one county to another, and that's an environmental factor that we haven't taken into consideration.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's sort of embedded within the state health department's guidance is that connection to the county health official so that they can provide you the most appropriate guidance for that situation, because they're the ones that are going to be monitoring occurrence of COVID cases and what the current situation is with regards to addressing those. And I think that's why we would view that to be the most appropriate and most important connection to make.
And let me just ask you something that really isn't embedded in the presentation this morning, yours or Jeff's or the others. But one of the things that I believe is occurring is that as we've begun to open up in California, just as an example, that we are now seeing more cases of COVID-19 because there are more people that are out and about in stores, in other locations. Am I accurate in that? Is that what you're saying? Because I'm believing you look at these statistics all the time.
Yeah, again, I do want to be clear about my role here, and so that it's an appropriate question, and it's something I don't have the national perspective. We track information, we provide information as they come to us, but I really don't want to try to comment too much about trends.
But have you looked at California? Have you seen California by any chance?
I've not looked at specific at California. I mean, there's been some news stories about it, but I have not looked at the statistics specifically for California. When
this was reported in, maybe it was the Wall Street Journal, maybe it was the Times a day or so ago, that there was an increase. There was an increase in particular in LA County, the LA County basin area, and there's about 10 million people in that area of California. So that's basically, that's a fourth of the California population, that one area. So I thought that was noteworthy. In the Sacramento area, I think it's been under control, but I believe that there have been some increased cases today. I don't mean today, I mean this week or since things have been opening up. And I mentioned that because we are at this point, and the point of this entire webinar is there's risk and liability to do the job that we're here to do, and that is to educate children, to accept them back into school, to make them safe. But that there may be some cases, there may be a reemergence, and isn't something I think that we should panic about. I think it's something we're here to make good decisions about controlling going in and controlling while we're there. I think Don's approach is a solid one. But I'll stop with my questions. But I greatly appreciate your helping me, both you, Mark, and also you, Jeff.
Yeah, and to your point about the California situation, I would recommend maybe perhaps for a future, if you've not done so already, maybe to have someone from the state health department perhaps participate where they can provide you more specific details about the situation there than I can.
Thank you.
Wow, great information. It's funny, in our area, we always thought we'd be preparing for a huge earthquake, which is a totally different preparation than, for this pandemic. And that's what we always practiced and always prepared for, is what do we do when the big one hits, because it's going to affect buildings and students and roads and logistics of getting things in and out. And this one really is different, except that now I know I need to buy toilet paper right away. So.
Did we still have time? But however you wanted to finish.
Sure, no, please.
Yeah, one of the things I thought having Mark in is since he's used to kind of a systematic approach dealing with crisis and recovery, there were still some questions kind of leading in that might be helpful to us, just kind of getting a framework for us of kind of a new way of thinking. And so Mark, with some of your experience, we had talked about some of the short-term and long-term things to keep in mind. And we have those, the next slide, we have some of the short-term. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of those?
Yeah, I think we've touched on this. And I think, each community, each school district is going to have a somewhat different set of challenges that you'll need to, and you're already facing those, and dealing with sort of how do you prioritize your measures you're planning to implement. And I guess the important thing we wanted to emphasize, which I'm sure you're already doing, partnerships with students and teachers, parents in that process, so that everyone can participate in redeveloping and implementing those measures and reinforcing those for months to come. So those are the short-term issues that are, I think, pretty obvious to all of you. And then the next slide has some long-term issues, and this is where maybe Jeff's profession can provide some input in terms of how we look forward to using sort of design technology to look for ways to prevent this from happening, or at least reduce the likelihood or the impact of this if it were to happen in the future. And so I think that's where the kind of partnerships with multi-disciplines can help that process, engaging a wide variety of disciplines to help in that process and provide planning to in the future. I think our last slide has some just kind of ideas, and we've already talked about this, and this is why we wanted to emphasize the availability of resources that can provide guidance. There's probably more guidance than you have time to read, but it's a matter of identifying what are the most appropriate resources that help you make decisions. And then most importantly, developing kind of collaborative partnerships that that help you implement that guidance. And then the last point I was trying to get to also is learning from the experience and sharing that through forums like this, where you can then, based on your experience, find out what works, maybe what didn't work, that can learn from, and that information can be shared with health agencies that can help refine and improve our guidance in the future.
Yeah, I think that was the big point, kind of great landing point, is that, through this cross-discipline approach of looking at all the different venues and avenues of issues and risks, but making a step forward. I think I really appreciate this approach with Clovis. And one thing that we're trying to do is be an advocate or a facilitator, creating kind of a white paper. And this is another kind of a scientific thing that would be great with your mindset of actually creating a living document where we are testing out a theorem, putting it into practice, and then testing its effectiveness. How well did it actually work? Most of us are familiar with educational commissioning. This is almost another layer of that. And I thought it was great, your idea about how bringing students in and teachers, that this is a real life learning opportunity, that by bringing them in, it actually helps facilitate it. So I'm not sure exactly what that might look like, but I would just invite others to participate. We're starting something. Dr. Olive had mentioned about surveys. If there's a way that we can kind of come together and share information and success, I think Tom is probably going to be talking more about some of the future things happening, and Julie is planning. And we just love to be a part of what's happening, and really appreciate Mark, you being here. And I think there's some resources that we have at the end. You want to talk a little bit more about that, Mark?
Yeah, these are some web links that it was a starting point. I've mentioned a few of them already. That another group that we haven't touched on is, I think, would be important to include, and I'm sure you're engaged with them at the local level, is school nurses, because they're the front line of health issues with students. They're going to be probably the ones that are going to be trying to implementing kind of screening. So and they have a good website with some guidance. So I think it's another group that be part of this partnership process, as well as the local health, state health, and CDC, as well as Department of Education.
Yeah, just want to thank the time. I want to thank you, Mark, for coming in and helping us and having your mindset, because this is very unfamiliar to most of all of us. And so thanks for coming in. Really appreciate it. And thanks for Cash.
Well, Jeff, Mark, thank you so much on that. That is some really great thought producing items and things to go for resources. And I think that's what we're all looking for, is where best to find answers that fits our counties and our school districts. And I think that is what's going to be so important, as we each kind of have different opening and different ways that we're going to educate our kids come August. So it will be, again, a challenge that we're going to, one way or another, solve and be up for it. So thank you. And I know we're running just a few minutes late, but let me say, we just thank Jeff and Mark, but I also want to thank Anthony, Robert, Eva, Don, Jeff, and of course, Mr. Tom Duffy, and our Zoom wizards behind the scenes, Sam Campbell and Heidi. Thank you guys so much. Our next CASH webinar, offered on Thursday, June 18th, will be the FEMA disaster funding, counting every dollar. The CASH webinar will discuss opportunities to seek disaster assistance from the Federal Emergency Management Agency to address local impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. We'll hear from those with expertise in pursuing, receiving, spending, and accounting for such federal fund receivings. The level of scrutiny of the FEMA audits will also be addressed, and we'll have state level panelists who will offer advice on working with the federal agencies. Then Tuesday, CASH 16th, we're going to do a web shop, and we'll also have the second one, part 2, on Friday the 19th, and it's on bonds, bond refinancing, certificates of participation, leases, and funding alternatives during our pandemic. In this web shop, we're going to provide attendees with current information addressing financing, funding opportunities. We'll also include our bond underwriters, bond counsel, financial consultants, and our favorite pollster, as we know, Bob, our financial consultants, and all those who will speak for means to accessing capital funding. So that's what our panelists will discuss next week. Attendees will also hear from Sacramento experts about the status of state capital general fund policy decisions, other policy implications for protecting and using the RRM, our routine restricted maintenance, our energy policy, the split roll proposition slated for November ballot, and the newest information from Washington, D.C. from our federal lobbyists. So Cash, myself, and all the present on the webinar today extend our best wishes for continued good health to you and your family. Cash will continue to keep you informed through emails and webinars on COVID-19 as this world continues to evolve. Gratitude and thanks to our essential workers and frontline heroes out there. As we mentioned, let's all look inside ourselves and reflect on the strength of the human spirit and the preciousness of life and choose to do better and be better. As we leave today, remember Cash organization is here to be a resource to help you all. And again, go to the Cash website, click on the COVID-19 link. You're going to see this presentation with its recordings. It'll be up in a couple of days. You'll see the past 10 that we've done. So please use those resources as you help devise your plan. And it's as Mark mentioned, it's so important that we in our school construction industry share vital information with each other. And I want to say thank you, and we'll see you next week. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julie.